I don't even think that most of the commercial patterns have all the information that you really need on your patterns. Particularly when you start tracing and making your own patterns, it becomes really clear. If you want a more systematized and long-term approach to your patterns, i.e. treating them more like a block, something you can come back to and use again, in this video let's talk about all of the labelings and markings that you really need on your patterns so that you can have a more longer term approach and know exactly what is going on no matter when you pick up this pattern in time, and don't waste all that hard work that you made creating it in the first place. Welcome back, my sewing friends. It is absolutely wonderful to see you here again. Thank you for watching and tuning in. If you're brand new here, welcome. My name's Evelyn Wood. I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com. And here on this channel, we talk everything about garment sewing so you can get better at sewing the clothes that you really want to wear. So do hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already, if that's what you're interested in, because I bet it is. That's why you clicked on this video. We are talking patterns today, and I know there's nothing worse, and I know you know this too, than when you pick up your pattern and you can't understand what is going on. Be it either that the commercial pattern didn't have all the information that you really need, or it's not very clear, or of course when you start tracing off your patterns and making your own patterns, altering and everything, you've got this, you need to know really well what to be able to put on here so you can look at it with just a glance and be able to understand, identify the pattern. Are all the pattern pieces there? How many, like cutting instructions, and then at a glance you'll even know how it's going to be all sewn together. All of this should be all on your pattern so you can really start using it like a block. When you start making and investing all of this time into your patterns, you can pick it up in 6 months' time and you'll know all of this, and you can just take off where you left off and all your hard work isn't missed. I kind of think of like not labeling your patterns correctly or all the way is kind of like doing 80% of the job. When you come back, you'll think, how much seam allowance was on that? Did I add a hem, or what kind of zip did I put on here? Does this have a facing to finish it? I can't remember. How many pieces were in it? Like all these questions, if you don't label it properly, all of that work you put into making it in the first place just kind of goes out the window, and we don't want that for you, of course. So let's look at all the different labelings. Now this is a mix of what you find on commercial patterns and a mix of what I've learned in industry and my own formulation of those to what makes sense so I can pick up a pattern anytime and I know all the things that I need to know. Obviously, let's start with a pattern name. So this might be the pattern number that maybe you're copying it from, so you can know which one you started with, your commercial pattern, or you just give it a new name yourself. Maybe it's your block, maybe you call it the, this dress is the Dala dress, so that's what I would call it. This bodice though, let's give this its name. I like to make that the biggest part of it. Then we need what pattern piece this is. So is it the sleeve? Is it the front, bodice front? Is it a dress skirt back, side back? Put exactly what the piece is. This one here is actually my bodice back. So if this was the Dala dress, but it would still be bodice back. I've just called this bodice block. Now next up is a size. Generally when we're working at home, we're making this for ourselves. So I would suggest here you either put your size, like your current measurements that you have made this to, particularly if you fluctuate up and down. If you stay relatively the same weight and not too much drama, you just put my size. Otherwise, you could actually put the size pattern that you started with, if this makes sense for you, and maybe altered from there or something like that. But whatever makes sense for you to know what you want. Think about if you came back in 6 months' time to remake this pattern, what would you want to know about the size of it? That's what you should put there. So I'm just going to put my size for mine because that's what I put, or size me is often fun. The next thing to add is you want to know how many pattern pieces there should be in this pattern to make sure that you have every single piece, because well, you all know those little facing pieces tend to go missing. So this is how I write it. And so let's pretend like I have, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 5 pieces in this pattern. So it's actually a bodice, the back that I have here, the front piece, of course, then I would have a sleeve, and then I also have a facing for front and back. So that's 5 pieces in total for this pattern. And so how I would mark this is I would say this is pattern piece 1 of 5. And so then you have 2 of 5, 3 of 5, 4 of 5, 5 of 5. And you keep going through each of those for each pattern piece. That way you can put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you know you've got all of the pattern pieces in this piece and nothing is missing. Now the next is cutting instructions, and this is quite important because you need to know when you're coming back here how to cut it. It's not always so obvious, and you know, sometimes it is when you do a bodice and you think, oh, I know what's going on, but trust me, write your cutting instructions. So cutting instructions will mean, you know, cut 1 on fold, cut 2 on pair on the fold, if you need 2 of them, or cut 2 pair. So if you need, maybe like if you're doing single layer and single layer, that you need a pair, not just on the fold, or maybe it's just cut 1 pair is what I say when it's not on the fold, but your fabric is folded together. So you have right sides together, but there's no fold, but because they're right sides together, that is actually 1 pair, right? Now, a lot of these will say cut 2, but that's technically incorrect because 2 is like 1 pattern piece, 2 pattern piece. That is 2 of the same thing. We actually want 2 pieces, but they are 1 pair. Do you get what I mean? Yeah, so it's a little tricky, but this is the kinds of things that really make a difference. So either 1 pair, cut on fold, what do you need to cut? And also add interfacing. If it's a facing, so say if your facing is cut 1 on fold, then in another box, I would put cut 1 on fold interfacing as well. So for this one, I'll write my cutting instructions, cut 1 on fold. And I always like to circle the cutting instructions. I just was always taught that way back in design school so that it's separate information, so you can easily glance at the pattern when you're on the table and you know that everything in circles is cutting information. It just helps section the different bits of information off. So you can do what you like, but that's why I do the circle. That's it for the sort of mostly labeling about what the pattern piece is. The next are all the markings that you really need. And of course, you must have already noticed we need a grain line. Every single pattern piece must have a grain line. If you don't know how important that is, I've made other videos here on the grain line, but make sure your grain line is marked in and make sure your grain line is, well, put it through all the way of the pattern. It should be at least, 70-80% of the length of the pattern. I hate these commercial patterns that make this teeny tiny grain line and it's this long. No, you need it all the length so you can measure off and get the most accurate grain line length. So go ahead and mark your grain line. So grain lines are always usually indicated with the line and the 2 arrows. That's how you know it's a grain line and not some other line on your pattern. Along with this, if you have any fold lines or anything like that, make sure that those are marked in and clearly labeled. So make sure you put center front on fold, center back on fold, so that it's really clear what is happening. And your fold lines are generally always indicated with arrows coming up and across like a little bracket over the line that it is going to be folded on. And I usually always put little arrows here from habit because the fold line is on the grain line, of course, as well. So of course this is in fact the grain line as well. But clearly here I can see what's going on and I know this is my center back fold. The next one, I can't urge you enough to do this all the way on every pattern, is marking your stitch line and any seam, like your seam allowances, your stitch line, same thing. Mark it all over your pattern on every single piece, because then when it's done, you get to glance at your pattern and you know exactly what is going on. You know how much seam allowance you have on where when you go to sew it. And also if you're making future pattern alterations, it's really easy when your stitch line is already marked out, and it's easy to then check your pattern when you have your stitch line already. So if you don't have this, I mean, if this is what you're labeling when you've just finished marking and everything, you're just making your pattern, you check your pattern, you'll need all your seam lines marked in first. So make sure you mark in all of those, all of them. At an absolute minimum, you want to mark in every stitch line at each corner of your pattern. So make sure you have each of those marked in through there and there. But I recommend drawing it in the entire way around, because it really makes your pattern so much more readable and easy to understand. Right, now we're really coming along and starting to look like a pattern that we can really understand. Okay, the next thing you need to add, if you haven't already, is all of the notches you need. Now, yes, commercial patterns do not have all the notches you need most of the time, and there's many more that you need to make. This video is not about what notches to make, because it really depends on your pattern piece, of course, but if you're interested, of course, this is exactly the kind of information that we have inside Vintage Sewing School. That is what I do there and why I have made that specifically. It is all of these finer learnings, like how to know where to put notches, like figure it out yourself, understand what's going on, so then you can really start making these patterns your own. That is what we do at Vintage Sewing School. It's all of that extra information that you just don't find anywhere else, in order, step by step, searchable anytime you need it. You have access to it 24/7 as a full member. That's what I create there, and that's what I love to see you grow your skills. So if you're ready to really grow your skills like that, I would absolutely love to have you in class. I put links down below to Vintage Sewing School. Come join me there anytime. So a lot of these notches you should have already transferred to your pattern as you're making it from your original pattern. Obviously transfer any specific ones, or as you've traced it and everything, those should have been already there. So I'll pretend like my ones from my pattern here, let's just say these were already here. And so I would actually mark, I would need notches on my back here. If there's any notches around your neckline, fold lines along the side seams to mark backs and fronts on your sleeves, everything. Put every notch that you need. Again, it's hard to know what you need at the beginning, but transfer everything, at least from your pattern, to your new pattern. And I have made other videos before on how to actually make notches on your fabric. This video, I'll link that down below, because there's different ways to mark it all. Again, that's not this particular video, but links down below for that. So I would actually always notch the fold lines, the centers, which no commercial pattern tells you to do, but you need it, trust me. If there is any additional things happening on your pattern, like pleats, like maybe stitch lines to stitch decorative stitching on, or anything else, write it on. And so this is where you can actually write other things. Like you could, on your neckline, you could put finished with facing, or finish with bias tape, bias facing. You could write that on your pattern here around your neckline, so when you come back and you look at this, you know exactly what was happening there and why there, say, isn't a facing piece if it's going to be with a bias facing. Or you know, maybe it's like a hem is going to be a double turn hem, or it's going to be a whatever you is. You might like to put how you're going to finish the different things on here as well. That gives you that information. Anything you need to know when you look at this next time, put those in. Like pleat lines, as I said, fold to here, and pleats, it's a bit more technical, but make sure everything else is marked in too. Because next, you might notice I said nothing about squares and dots. You know, on these, and they say sew to square and then stop at dot here to square there. I know, you definitely need to copy them if you're copying the sewing instructions, and that's how you're putting it together, because that's how you'll know how to put it together. As you get more experienced, you'll realize that a lot of these squares and dots that they talk about are points that are probably already, now that you've labeled everything, marked on your pattern. So they're often squares and dots are actually something like you need to sew to the square or something. It's actually sew to the stitch line, like where these points meet here, for example, because you need this little stitch point open, and they're very often in places like that. Or if it's notches for, say, gather in between like this and this, and to gather in squares and dots, what I would do, and I teach all my students to do, is use notches. You don't need to put squares and dots, because if you're using ink, like how can that, they will blotch out to the same thing anyway. You use notches for those. And if it's clearly marked on your pattern and you know you've got gathers, and I usually little squiggle line and gathers in between these 2 points. Again, that's something that we talk specific in Vintage Sewing School, but that's how you would mark sort of gathers and things like that, is with notches, not squares and dots so much. So if you are copying, at this point, you're just beginning, just put your squares and your dots the same, and you'll know that as you progress, those squares and dots will just turn into intuitive places that you know to sew to, and you can actually use notches for the rest of them when you start to understand your patterns better. That's what you're aiming for, to be able to make a more streamlined, faster process that you don't need to start looking up where squares and dots are. You've just got your notches to follow. Now let's just take one moment here to look at our before our pattern, where it's basically just a piece of paper, and now our after pattern that we have all of our labeling and markings on, because I know which one I can pick up and exactly know what the pattern is, like what the design is. I know what pattern piece it is. I know how many pieces are in the actual pattern. Do I have them all? I know how to cut it, all my cutting instructions for each item, so I know how many, etc., and interfacings and all of that. I know what's on a fold and what's not. I can look at this. I know what my grain line is, where my stitch lines all are, or my seam allowances to sew it together. I know I've got 1 centimeter at my neckline, 1.5 everywhere, and I've got a 2 centimeter hem. I can see this instantly by looking at this. I know how to almost sew it together because I've got all my notches, etc., all here, all labeled perfectly. I know which one I will pick up and instantly know what it is and what to do with it. And there is one more bonus tip for you, and that is with your entire pattern that you package up together, is leave a few notes for yourself for next time. So what would you want to make differently next time? Because we always sew something up and there's always something that we'd like to change. So leave yourself a little note, A4 piece of paper, that says maybe something like, was the red dress that you made up out of the whatever fabric, and you'll think, oh yeah, of course I made that in that dress. I remember that one. I have it in my wardrobe still. Then write any notes that you thought that you want to change next time that you haven't already made to your pattern. So for example, maybe you've let's not use an invisible zip, let's do a lapped zip, because they're way better, everybody knows that. Or maybe add 2 inches extra length is something that you maybe figured out, or something about the sizing to tweak a little bit. Write yourself notes so that when you open this pattern out next time, you're already a head start and you can just take off exactly where you left off on this pattern. And basically that's how you keep tweaking these patterns to be more perfect and more perfect each time. This becomes your block pattern, and it is absolutely worth putting all of this labeling and everything here, because you're going to reuse it in a more workable wardrobe system and use your patterns again and again and keep tweaking and using them and get the most out of the work that you put into your patterns. That's the way that I teach everyone to use patterns, and that's what I want for you, and I'm sure you want that for yourself as well. Who would have thought there was so much into labeling patterns? I know. I would love to hear your comments below. What have you been missing, or what are you now going to make sure that you label all the time regardless, or what was the mistakes that you made by not labeling? I would love to hear those as well. What did you miss? Because remember to read the comments down below. There'll be such a wealth of information from our community members here. And so thank you very much for watching, my friends. Until next time, happy sewing. Bye.